today's event, a book event. We're very happy to have Max Blumenthal with us today. He's the author of a new book called Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. The book, of course, is available here for purchase, and I'm sure Max will be happy to put his autograph on some of those copies as well for you after the discussion. Max is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author whose articles and video documentaries have appeared in various publications, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Daily Beast, and so on. And his previous book, Republican Gomorrah, Inside the Movement That Shattered the Party, was a New York Times and LA Times bestseller. He blogs at maxblumenthal.com. This book is a really fascinating look into modern-day Israel, not inside the occupied West Bank, but really focusing on racism and discrimination inside what is the state of Israel today and its treatment of minorities there. And Max will tell you plenty about that, and also show a bit of a documentary after the discussion as well. So please join me in welcoming Max Blumenthal.
Can I get water up here, please? I need all kinds of liquids to keep going. I was up late writing my response to Eric Alterman, so you'll have to forgive me for being a little bit winded. A big waste of energy, actually. But anyway, welcome to the Hamas Book Club, Friends of Hamas. It's good to be here among friends and well-wishers. My tour has been really interesting. This is actually my first real extended talk on the tour. I just did a great event at UPenn, my alma mater, with Ian Lustig, which was really well attended and refreshing to see the atmosphere there, since I was at UPenn over 10 years ago, and the only protest they had on campus when I was there was against the temporary ban on beer. And now you're seeing an active Students for Justice in Palestine chapter really defining the atmosphere and the debate around this issue, and we're seeing that on campuses across the country. We just saw at UCLA an anti-divestment resolution struck down, and we're going to continue to see these resolutions struck down. But at the same time, Yusuf mentioned my last book, which was a bestseller. It was a bestseller because I was able to get fresh air in the mainstream media. Terry Gross hosted me, and as soon as within 5 minutes of her hosting me on NPR, the book was up at number 8 overall on Amazon, ahead of Glenn Beck and Michelle Malkin, who were basically being bulk bought so right-wing billionaires could insulate their homes with the walls of their homes with these books. But this time, Terry Gross has explicitly refused to host me. The New York Times solicited a video I might have time to show later, a documentary I did with David Sheen. They actually called me and asked me to make this documentary about Israel's abuse of non-Jewish African refugees. But when they actually saw it and saw our real footage, they rejected it without explanation. And so we went to The Nation, which didn't unfortunately, they were nice to excerpt a piece from my book, but they kind of buried the video. So Ali Abunema went ahead and promoted it, and now it's up at over 250,000 views. And people who have been exposed to this issue for the first time are incredibly shocked, especially African Americans. And I'm hoping that African American mainstream media will begin to cover this issue and wonder why the son of Africa and the first African-American president, Barack Obama, has said nothing about this. My book, I think, will have a long shelf life. It might be an evergreen book, hopefully, even if it doesn't get the attention it deserves, because it's one of the first books to paint a portrait of the state of Israel, Israeli society, and Israel-Palestine, this one state with no defined borders under a regime of ethnic separation, at the culmination of a transitional phase that began after the Second Intifada and the collapse of the Camp David talks, and really the collapse of the peace process. And what we're seeing right now is the state of Israel, the Jewish state, acting out the terminal phase of Zionism. There was a really interesting article in the New Yorker that me and Yusuf were just talking about the ethnic cleansing of Lida by Ari Shavit, who's kind of the Thomas Friedman of Israel. I don't know why he is the one who gets published to talk about the Nakba, but it's still nice to see some kind of recitation of the history, even if he gets the history slightly wrong. But I just want to focus on one point in Shavit's piece, which really relates to some of the backdrop that I said in my book, which is that Lida was the black box of Zionism. In other words, that the Zionist project required the ethnic cleansing of Lida, and this is an ongoing and continuous project, and as long as Zionism is in its current form is sustained, it requires this kind of ethnic cleansing in order to sustain this project. And Shavit concludes that this is too immense of a point for him to grapple with, which is a new way of saying it's complicated. In other words, he can't come to a clear conclusion about whether this can continue. He can only say, this is the reason why I was born and why I'm here, but it's too big for me to deal with. So let's just maintain the status quo. Now, in my book, I enter the book after kind of establishing the right-wing government that's come into power at this culmination of this transitional phase after the 2009 national elections, which were carried out against the backdrop of Operation Cast Lead. And I love this knocking. I was saying every time I try to sleep or talk, there's some construction. But, and with Israelis going up on Parash Hill, which is a hill above the Gaza Strip, to actually watch the killing take place, to watch the bombing take place, and to cheer it on. And meanwhile, they were electing the most right-wing government in their history. 75 to 80 members of the 120-member Knesset were from right-wing parties. And so I enter the book, and of course I enter at Ben Gurion International Airport. Ben Gurion International Airport, when you fly in there, you fly to Tel Aviv. It says TLV when you fly in, but you're not actually flying into Tel Aviv. You're really flying into what was once Lida. And the airport belonged to the British colonial authorities at the time, and the area around the airport, and the airport itself, were conquered or brought under control during the process of ethnic cleansing known as Operation Dani. And Shavit gets this wrong in his account. He doesn't. He misnames the operation. So my book. So in an opening chapter in my book, number 1, I talk about how 55,000 people were sent eastward to Ramallah. I mean, this is when the population of Ramallah spiked on the Lida death march, and there was a doctor, a young doctor, who was trapped while people were being marched out, and there was an Israeli-imposed curfew, and he was inside the Lida hospital, and he's overcome with horror at what he had witnessed. His sister died in front of his eyes, but because of the curfew, he couldn't bury her, so he went out in the yard with his bare hands and dug a grave for her. And he treated dozens and dozens and dozens of patients who literally died in his arms. His name was George Habash. He went on to found the PFLP. Riding into Lida in an armored car he dubbed the Terrible Tiger at the helm of the 89th Commando Battalion was a little-known career soldier. His name was Moshe Dayan. And after Dayan's blitz into the city, an embedded reporter from the New York Herald Tribune surveyed the damage. And thank God Ethan Bronner or Jody Rudoran wasn't there. The corpses of Arab men, women, and even children strewn about in the wake of the ruthlessly brilliant charge. Practically everything in their way died, a Chicago Sun-Times reporter wrote of the Israeli forces, describing Operation Dani as a blitzkrieg. This was just 3 years after World War II ended. More than 170 Palestinian Arabs instructed to take shelter in the Dahmash Mosque near Ramleh were slaughtered by forces under Yitzhak Rabin and Yigal Alon's direct command, then left to rot in the July heat. About 20 to 50 more Palestinian men were sent into the mosque by Israeli forces to extract the corpses and bury them, were shot dead in the graves they had just dug. Some soldiers robbed fleeing Palestinians of their gold jewelry. Others, according to Amos Kenan, a famous Israeli writer and bon vivant, who participated in the conquest of Lida, took further liberties. At night, Kenan casually recalled in a 1989 article for The Nation, those of us who couldn't restrain ourselves would go into the prison compounds to fuck Arab women. A few soldiers caught up in the orgy of violence succumbed to psychological trauma. As Rabin later recalled, prolonged propaganda activities were required after the action to explain why we were obliged to take such a harsh and cruel action. This is sort of absent from Shavit's account. But this is what Shavit maintains was necessary to birth the Jewish state. And he says, justifying it, that the Holocaust was in the background, something I'm going to get into later. David Ben-Gurion, was asked for instructions by Yitzhak Rabin and Yigal Allon. What do we do? There's all these Arabs in Lida. What do we do? And Ben-Gurion understood that there had just been a series of trials over the crimes committed in Europe, and that the evidence used in these trials relied on written transcripts and written records of orders. The Germans kept meticulous records of their orders, obviously. And so Ben-Gurion said nothing. According to Rabin, he went. And so that stern wave of his hand was what brought Lida under Israeli control and transformed it into the Ramleh Lod municipal district. It is also what transformed Lod Airport, or Lida Airport, into Ben Gurion International Airport, this cavernous modern glass and steel edifice that from an exterior glance looks like any other airport in the Western world. But once you land or you seek to depart from Israel, you're immediately classified according to your ethnicity and your religion, even your gender. These masquerades are presented as security measures, but in fact they're just crude ethnic profiling, which I, like everyone else, was subjected to. And when you get there, or when you leave, you are given a number. You're assigned a number from 1 to 6 based on your ethnicity, and your ethnicity is, of course, linked to some kind of security threat. I usually get number 1. I'm number 1 because I have J-positive blood. Others are assigned a different number, like Noor Judah, who had attempted to reach her students in Ramallah at the Quaker school she was teaching at, who is an American, just like me, who is a good friend of many of my friends in Ramallah, but she doesn't have the same ethnicity, and so she was given a number 6. First she was held at the Allenby border and then told to re-enter in Ben Gurion. It was from there that she was sent away and banned for 10 years. Donna Shalala, the former Clinton, she was the labor secretary or the health secretary? Yeah. She made such an impact on me that I can't remember. She is, Lebanese American. She was on her way to a conference in Israel of university presidents. She was the president of University of Miami on fighting BDS on campus, and she was held and interrogated at the airport for well over 2 hours in a humiliating interrogation that really was a form of poetic justice. Anna Likas Miller, who is a journalistic friend of mine, was on her way had already been handed out a peculiar visa because of her ethnicity that only limited her to 2 weeks and only within what the Israelis call Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. And she had wanted to re-enter and take a real trip around the Holy Land, so she signed up for what was basically a Hasbara, or propaganda conference, presenting Israel to journalists, which was sponsored by groups linked to the Israeli government at the IDC Herzliya. So on her way in, she was held for 5 to 10 hours, I think. Then she was sent away, banned for 10 years on the basis of her ethnicity. She's actually a writer for Open Zion, which is Peter Beinart's blog at Newsweek. Leaving aside the fact that Newsweek's blog on the Middle East is called Open Zion, you would have thought that this would have kind of been something that worked in her favor, but it didn't, because it's all about your ethnicity, and everything flows peripatetically from Ben Gurion Airport into Israeli society and to all the territory that Israel controls, where one ethnicity is privileged over all others. And what I found inside when I went on my first sustained reporting trip in May 2009, by immersing myself immediately in the key institutions of Israeli life, was an attempt by these right-wing forces to bring apartheid out into the open, to strip away the veneer of democracy and get it over with, because the mood of the Israeli public, particularly the young Jewish Israelis, was one of frustration with an endless peace process. They regard it as a joke. Frustration with the idea that the West Bank can't be annexed. Of course, they've been taught that this is their land. Frustration with the fact that the Palestinians will simply not go away. And they've been taught that these people are the occupiers of their God-given land. And so why not just get it over with? It's why Avigdor Lieberman won high school elections in 2009 by an overwhelming majority. Actually, the Meretz party didn't even register. The vote count was so low. And so these laws started being passed in the Knesset, which Lieberman campaigned on. His campaign was no citizenship, no loyalty, no citizenship. And one of the first laws was the loyalty oath, which was actually not proposed by Lieberman, but by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This was an amendment to Israel's citizenship law, which requires new citizens to swear loyalty to the Jewish and democratic state, which relates completely to Jerusalem, where Palestinian residents who live in occupied East Jerusalem are offered the option of taking citizenship, but this is an attempt to pretty much rule that out. The Acceptance to Communities law was a new law proposed in the Knesset, which passed, allowing discrimination on the basis of religion or ethnicity or sexuality in communities of under 500. This was an attempt to upend or nullify the Qadan ruling by the Supreme Court, which had allowed one Arab family to take up residence in one of the mitzvah communities, which are small all-Jewish communities built in the north of Israel surrounding Palestinian towns and cities to limit their natural growth. This is a huge controversy. And just by allowing one Arab family to purchase property in one of these towns inside Israel, who are citizens of Israel, necessitated this law. Then Avigdor, the former head of the Shin Bet, who was from Tzipi Livni's Kadima party, proposed a law defining Israel's Jewish character as above or preeminent or superior to its democratic charter, and would make Hebrew the official language and reduce and strip Arabic of its official language status. This law did not pass, but it's been reintroduced by Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, who's his deputy, from the Jewish Home Party, which has done very well in recent municipal elections. There was the anti-incitement law, which was proposed by the Jewish Home Party during the last Knesset, which would have imprisoned people for 1 year for convincing another person to be disloyal to the Jewish state. This has not passed yet. Hanin Zouabi, the most visible representative from the Balad party, which advocates a state of all its citizens, was banned by the Israeli Central Election Committee from running again. The Supreme Court overturned the ban, as it always does to these Central Election Committee rulings, and this is leading into another law. And of course, we remember that, and I interviewed Zouabi in my book, and I write about how she was almost nearly physically assaulted in the Knesset, but more interesting than that was the fact that no prominent Israeli liberal that I can think of, except for maybe one or two, stepped up to defend her, which stood in remarkable contrast to what happened when Tawfiq Toubi faced a similar incident. He was the first Palestinian to serve in the Knesset in the 1950s, and Ben-Gurion had called for him to be banned from the Knesset. And Ben-Gurion's closest friend, one of his closest friends, Natan Alterman, who was considered the poet of the establishment, this hero of labor Zionism, said that Toubi serves by right and not grace, and that he has we're supposed to be a democracy after all. Of course, he served in mainly a symbolic capacity. No Natan Alterman rose their voice for Zouabi, and she still faces this campaign of incitement. Then there was the BDS law, the boycott law. introduced by Zev Elkin, who is currently the acting foreign minister in place of Avigdor Lieberman, who goes on trial in 2 weeks for his mafia connections. And this law has been passed, and it allows lawsuits to be filed by settlers against anyone they feel has harmed their business by calling for a ban on the business that they carry out in occupied territory. So it's basically an attack on free speech. I interviewed David Rotem, who is the author of or co-sponsor of most of these laws, at his home in Efrat, the Israeli settlement, mega settlement in the West Bank. And Rotem is a fascinating character. He's from Lieberman's party, but unlike Lieberman, who's an atheist, he's a religious nationalist who is one of the original Gush Emunim settlers. He was a lawyer for the Gush Emunim. And he constantly brought our conversation back to the Holocaust to justify everything he was doing and all these laws, which in my mind resembled the early inception of the Nuremberg laws, stripping the ethnic outclass of their rights, of their legal rights. And he said, I have a chip on my shoulder and a tick in my brain, and it's called the Holocaust. I said, I can't debate you on anymore. And I said, but what we're looking at here and what you're doing is something that we reject in the United States, what Thomas Jefferson called the tyranny of the majority. And he shot back at me immediately. The tyranny of the majority is the essence of democracy. And I think that's the essence of what we're witnessing from this current government. And so I think we've been looking at these laws, and a lot of these laws are opposed by liberal groups inside Israel, like the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. But how far are these groups willing to go? Because a lot of these laws are actually amendments to laws that were passed right after the establishment of the State of Israel in order to limit the rights and freedom of movement of Palestinians who had been expelled. In particular, the Anti-Infiltration Act, which was passed in 1954 to prevent the thousands and thousands of Palestinian refugees who had been expelled from reuniting with their family members, returning to their farms, returning to their land. 90% of them, according to Benny Morris, were trying to return for economic reasons, not because they were fedayeen. But I write about this extensively, about this history, about the communities around the Gaza border and the attempts to limit what was known as infiltration. This law has been updated or amended because there are currently 60,000 non-Jewish Africans in Israel right now, been denied work permits. They're not allowed to work, and so many of them are living in desperate conditions in South Tel Aviv, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, one of the poorest areas in Israel. Many of them are sleeping in Levinsky Park because they can't make a living. Many of them rely on donated food. And the reason isn't because they're immigrants, because they're not citizens. The reason is because they're not Jews. They cannot be absorbed into the state because, as Benjamin Netanyahu said, they threaten the Jewish character of the state. And so there has been a concerted attempt to expel 100% of them, including those who are asylum seekers, who have fled from Janjaweed and Darfur, who have fled from repression in Eritrea, who have fled from genocide and war and poverty, thinking that if they arrived in the Jewish state, a state that claimed to represent the legacy of the Holocaust and the deliverance of people who have experienced a genocide, that they would be rescued. And they found of the asylum seekers, 0.07% have been granted asylum, the lowest of any industrialized nation in the world. There's actually no path to asylum for non-Jews in Israel. And so the Anti-Infiltration Act amendment mandated allowed their arrest without trial and detention for 3 years in a newly constructed facility called Saharonim in the Negev Desert, which former Speaker of the Knesset, Reuven Rivlin, of the Likud party, identified as a concentration camp. And there are currently thousands of non-Jewish Africans sleeping in shipping containers there right now, including entire families. And as we speak, 4 Israeli Jews are outside the gates protesting, determined to climb the gates and be continually arrested until the Africans are released. one of them, Ido Nave, put out a call for a mass demonstration, and 4 people arrived. We see in France that when Roma gypsy children are arrested in their schools, that school children go on strike by the hundreds and by the thousands, and even set up flaming barricades outside their school. We see no such thing in Israel, and as you'll see from this documentary, instead we see an entire mob turning on these outcasts. Actually, Saharonim, although it's a new facility, was built on top of Ketziot, where thousands of Palestinian political prisoners were held during the First Intifada by prison guards, including Colonel Jeffrey Goldberg. And so we have to see the continuous process here from Palestinians to non-Jewish Africans as Palestinian movement and their presence is limited inside the Green Line. And we have to see the same rhetoric that Meir Kahane used against Palestinians in the 1980s now being deployed against non-Jewish Africans. Miri Regev, the former spokesperson of the Israeli army, who is now a leading figure in Likud, a cabinet-level figure in Likud, who is one of the young Turks of Likud, who Netanyahu has to kind of hold off because they're so right-wing. At a rally on May 23rd, 2012, before about 1,000 people, said the Africans are a cancer in Israel's body. And hours later, hundreds of Israelis rioted through the neighborhood of Hatikva, smashing the windows of African storefronts and attacking any African they could find. Obviously, words have consequences. A poll reported in the Times of Israel found that a majority of Jewish Israelis agreed with Miri Regev's statement that Africans were a cancer in Israel's body. And I've been accused of being biased, but I haven't been able to find a scientist to determine if this was true, if they are a cancer or not. But it seems to me that this is incredibly dangerous rhetoric, and it's hard to be balanced about it. Now, after I arrived, I'm kind of moving around chronologically, but after I arrived, I settled down for a few months in Jaffa, which is another mixed city like Lod, where you have Jews and Palestinians living among each other. It is a site of ethnic cleansing. And I was living in Ajami on Dr. Ehrlich Street, which used to be named Dr. Fuad Dajani Street, because Fuad Dajani was ran the local hospital, which has been renamed Yacob Zehalon Hospital after a 17th century Italian physician. So all of this was there before under different names. It's now a mental facility it's now a geriatric ward for mentally ill patients, but it used to be a first-class Palestinian hospital. And it was basically seized during the Nakba, and the streets' names were all changed, and the remnants of the Palestinian community that was ethnically cleansed, who were literally thrown into the sea under artillery fire and forced to take boats to Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere, are what remains there. Jaffa was incorporated into the Tel Aviv municipality. The incumbent mayor, Ran Huldai, who was just reelected, has refused to allow any Arabic writing to be on the symbol of the Tel Aviv municipality because, as he says, their numbers are so low they only represent about 4%, which is actually fascinating to consider how much their growth has been deliberately limited by state planning, and the extent to which Tel Aviv is religiously homogenous. Actually, there are fewer Arabs living in Tel Aviv, a city in the Middle East, than the biggest city in the Midwest, Chicago. How did that happen? Tel Aviv requires the Iron Wall. So I would go jogging to Tel Aviv frequently, and I'd jog through this park known as Charles Clore Park, named after a British Jewish financier. They're these big grassy dunes. People like to barbecue on the dunes. And I realized that these dunes were actually the former neighborhood of Manshia, and that they weren't dunes before. They were actually artificially created because the dunes are basically the rubble of the hundreds of Palestinian homes that were bulldozed. 75% of the area was bulldozed in 1948. And it was then that I really began to understand the Nakba as a continuous process. I noticed the one remaining house near Charles Clore Park, the one remaining Arab home, had been converted into the Etzel Museum. The Etzel was the right-wing militia affiliated with the Stern Gang, which carried out the Deir Yassin massacre, and this is a state-run museum. So think of that next time Netanyahu talks about memorials to Palestinian terrorists in Ramallah. And you know, you would think that by this time, after such an extensive process of ethnic cleansing and limiting the Palestinian presence in Israel, that there would be a level of confidence if this was the kind of state that they wanted to create. But instead, as I continued to visit the Knesset, I experienced the deep insecurity that animates Israeli life, especially when I visited with Alex Miller, who was who was at the time a deputy of Netanyahu, of Avigdor Lieberman in the Knesset. I walked into his Spartan office. The only picture on the wall was a picture of Lieberman, the dear leader. He was playing Minesweeper. He was 28 years old, wearing a fine tailored suit, smoking a cigarette. There was one book on his shelf. It was Bill Clinton's My Life. I don't know what advice he took from there. And he was an immigrant from Moscow. His Hebrew was not as good as my translators, and he had a young man named Sa, who was a Tel Aviv University political science grad student, who would rush up and deliver him notes with talking points. When he would attack the United States for imposing pressure on Israel, he'd rush up with a talking point and he would read it. Israel's relationship with the U.S. is strong. And Miller was the author of the Nakba law, which I think is one of the most remarkable laws of this battery of anti-democratic laws, because this law actually sought to, in its original form, send Palestinian citizens of Israel to jail, or anyone to jail, for participating in observances of the Nakba on May 15th, which is also Israel's Independence Day, when Israeli Jews go out to places like Canada Park, which is an artificially built forest constructed over 3 destroyed Palestinian villages in the Latrun Pass. And Miller told me that in the United States, you would forbid some people from burning the American flag. Why can't we do that here? And I said, actually, that's not true. We don't do that. You don't understand democracy. So we had this uncomfortable confrontation or discussion. Many of my interviews were pretty uncomfortable, if you read the book. And I kind of walked out somewhat depressed, and I ran into Ahmed Tibi, the veteran Palestinian legislator in the Knesset. And he said, oh, so you met with Alex Miller. Well, this is, a classic example. Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. For Jews, it's democratic, and for Arabs, it's Jewish. I thought that was kind of a nifty quip that really summed up my feelings about this encounter. Unfortunately, the Nakba law passed in a diluted form, and now it is possible for the government to impose civil penalties or to strip funding from NGOs that participate in these commemorations of the Nakba. And then there's also a street-level campaign that's accompanying it, where the Israeli group Zochrot, which means memory, goes out every May 15th, and a few Israelis will read out the names of destroyed Palestinian villages, and they will basically be set on by mobs who have to be held back by the border police, by riot squads. This law was passed on the same night, at midnight, as the acceptance to communities laws. And one of the things I do in my book is I break down the votes of these laws, and I show how the Labor Party at the time stood aside, generally, didn't vote against these laws. How Kadima under Tzipi Livni, and we always hear Tzipi Livni in the Western media and the English media condemning the ill wind of anti-democratic laws passing through Israel. She would rarely vote against these laws. She said nothing about Hanin Zouabi being attacked by a bunch of men who used these kind of insults about her being a single woman. And she said she has rarely voted against these laws, and even, in fact, members of her own party have voted for them. So it's not just a right-wing campaign, it's also a capitulation of the Zionist left in the face of this campaign. I moved from Jaffa to Jerusalem to this little apartment that was filled with kind of young Israeli dissidents, along with my journalistic colleague Joseph Dana. The Oz unit, which is the immigration enforcement unit of the Israeli police, had just visited this apartment before I arrived, looking for an activist who had spent the night there. I don't know how they knew that she had spent the night there. She was from the ISM, the International Solidarity Movement. But this is a new thing you see a lot. The Oz unit, which is supposed to be going after migrants, is also going after activists everywhere. And I've even been held by them at the Tel Aviv bus station for reasons I can't explain. And so in Jerusalem, on the night before Barack Obama's historic speech to the Arab world in Cairo, a speech where any promise he made to the Palestinians he has completely reneged on, especially on respecting nonviolent resistance, we went out into Jerusalem and did some man-on-the-street interviews, and our now infamous Feeling the Hate in Jerusalem video was produced, showing mostly young American Jews, but also young Israelis, calling for Obama's assassination, calling him the N-word, calling for white power, without knowing who the Israeli prime minister was. Just ignorance and hatred on display from mostly American Jews from the Five Towns area of Long Island. It went viral, 500,000 hits in a few hours. YouTube banned it, Vimeo banned it, the Huffington Post banned it. The Huffington Post prevented me from even referring to it. Thank God they've been sold to AOL, because now I can actually go on HuffPost Live and mention it, which I recently did. And what we were trying to do was kind of send out a warning. There was a serious message in this video, which was that words have consequences. And just a few months after that video, a young man named Hussam Rouidi was walking home through central Jerusalem, a Palestinian resident of East Jerusalem. He was set on by two Jewish youth wearing Beitar Jerusalem scarves. Now, most of you are familiar with Beitar Jerusalem. It's the favorite football team of the far right in Israel. And the fanatics of this team chant death to Arabs pretty much after every goal. I have a whole chapter on them in my book. It's also a favorite team of Avigdor Lieberman. And they stabbed Rouidi in the neck. He walked into a restaurant, packed restaurant, pleading for help. I think someone offered him a napkin, and he bled to death in the street. And his killers were let off maybe with a few years. A few months after that, Jamal Joulani, in a more widely publicized incident, was set upon by a mob of Israeli youth, mostly teenagers, adolescents, and he was beaten into a coma while they chanted, "A Jew is a soul, an Arab is a son of a bitch," which is a Beitar Jerusalem chant. This was in the middle of Zion Square. If you've ever been there, this is a crowded place. And bystanders just stood there and watched and did nothing. And the reason they attacked him was because they had heard from a 15-year-old Jewish Israeli girl that he had made a pass at her. So echoes of 1930s Alabama playing out in a place that many American Jews consider the spiritual home of the Jewish people. And his attackers went to court and boasted of what they did and said, "I don't regret a thing. I only wish I had killed him." They're quoted in my book. This is what they're kind of, this is how they've been indoctrinated. They're being raised to be good soldiers, and this is play acting. And so we had done this video. We had been attacked by people like, we had been attacked mercilessly by the Jewish press. We had been banned, and now the consequences were playing out. So Yediot Aharonot sent out one of its reporters to do basically our video, Feeling the Hate, which uncovered the exact same thing we uncovered. And so I think it's becoming clear increasingly that this is systematic, and it's not something that's limited to drunk youth, that there's something going on here. I talk in my book extensively about the process of indoctrination that Israeli youth go through and why it's so hard for dissidents who reject the Zionist narrative and campaign for Palestinian equality emerge in Israeli society. It's not because of repression necessarily, although many of my dissident friends have been interrogated by the Shin Bet. It's indoctrination. I write about 4-year-olds in a preschool in Holon, this suburb of Tel Aviv, who are placed before a board, a diagram, which starts with a question: who wants to kill us? Then lines point to Arabs, Persians, Nazis, etc., the historical enemies of the Jewish people, with the Palestinians painted as the heirs of the Nazis. I talk about the trips to Auschwitz that Israeli high schoolers are increasingly taken on, which culminate with ceremony in a gas chamber where they're asked to take on the personas of Jewish children who are slaughtered. And I talk about the polls of those high schoolers after they emerge from these trips, which are explicitly designed to prepare them for the army, and how they develop more nationalistic sentiments after these tours and a more favorable impression of the army. And so this explains why so many we see the anti-democratic attitudes rising among Israeli youth, so that a majority of them would, according to a poll by Camille Fuchs, the most reputable pollster in Israel, would refuse to sit with an Arab in a classroom. And it's why we see the future of Israeli politics embodied by people who have undergone this indoctrination process. People like Naftali Bennett, who recently boasted, "I killed a lot of Arabs. That's a good thing. So what?" Who favors annexing the West Bank and basically bringing apartheid into the open. Who has recently, and this is something I won't have time to talk about, but maybe in Q&A we can do it. But he recently endorsed a lobbying campaign by the anti-miscegenation group Lehava, and in my book I talk about its sponsorship by the Israeli government to ban religious Jewish women from volunteering in hospitals after 9 p.m. because they could potentially date Arab doctors. This is a new bulletin that's been issued by the government, by the Civil Service Department of the Israeli government, with the endorsement of Naftali Bennett. It's why we increasingly see, let me wrap it up. The municipal elections were this week. I guess they happened yesterday, and we saw the further consolidation of right-wing domination. A recent poll by Globes, the Israeli news publication, found that or declared that there is nothing after Likud. In other words, Netanyahu has no rival or challenger. His only rivals or challengers are within his own party. The Young Turks, people like Tzipi Hotovely, who held Knesset hearings on the dangers of miscegenation and assimilation, and who favors annexing the West Bank. So we see the right moving further to the right. We saw that in the Jerusalem mayoral election with Nir Barkat, the architect of the settlers' expulsion campaigns in East Jerusalem, specifically in Sheikh Jarrah, running against a further right-wing candidate endorsed by Avigdor Lieberman, and members of the Israeli left cheering for Barkat's victory, members of the Zionist left. This has all happened within the Green Line. Everything I've talked about has occurred within the area of Israel that will be legitimized under a two-state solution, an area that is now almost entirely surrounded by walls and fortifications, a wall around the border of Gaza. Netanyahu has taken $200 million out of the Israeli social budget to build a wall on the Sinai border to prevent African migrants from entering. He has authorized funding $360 million for a wall along the border with Jordan, which Israel enjoys a supposed peace treaty with. There is a 600 or more kilometer wall built in and around the West Bank, which Netanyahu has said is designed to prevent demographic spillover. The Israeli-occupied frontier with Syria is completely mined, and then there are fences there. Israel is covered with an iron dome supplied by American taxpayers to the tune of $200 million. It's a hermetically sealed dystopia that fulfills the prophecy outlined in the book of Numbers, that the people of Israel will dwell alone and not be reckoned among the nations.
Thank you very much, Max. We're going to start our Q&A session now, and just a reminder to those following online, you could send in your questions, obviously, via Twitter. Send them to @Palestine Center, and we'll pass them on to Max. And if you have questions, you can send them in also through Facebook and on the chat roll. So what we'll do is we'll go around the room, and if you could just wait for the microphone so they can hear you on the live stream as well, we'd appreciate it. And we'll start right over here, and then we'll work our way across. So
I think we can do the documentary as bonus. I'm sure many of you have seen it already. All right, so after Q&A, whoever wants to stay.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk today. My name is Mohammed. I am a current Sci student. And I wanted to ask you maybe a bit about, well, first of all, as an Arab, it's refreshing to see non-Arabs speaking about this issue. And I think it's very empowering. Of course, the words that you say are infinitely more powerful, I think, than anything that I could do now. But
it's a tragedy, isn't it?
It is. I think it is. It really is. But I was wondering, how can the Arab society and the Arab communities, both in America and the Middle East, how can we empower people that are taking the steps that you're taking, and then how can we empower those Israelis in Israel that are fighting against this right-wing, anti-democratic establishment that is forming? And then finally, what's your motivation for writing this book?
I'll try to be quick so we can get everything in, because those are really great questions, which I think deserve like an extensive answer. And if you're at SAIS, first of all, read my article on Elliot Cohen. I don't take his class. Actually, I hear he's better than Fuad Ajami. So he's not. Okay. Well, I'm hoping he'll write a review of my book. But anyway, I don't think we Jewish critics of Israel, or whatever you want to call us, Jewish anti-Zionists, Jewish supporters of Palestinian rights, need any help, especially from people who are already marginalized and under attack. I think it's what Arab Americans need to do, young Arab Americans who really are in solidarity with Palestinian rights. And what Muslim Americans need to do is take control of their established organizations and get them to begin supporting things like BDS, and to stop this conciliatory attitude, which really reflects the posture of Jewish organizations in the 1950s, when they were ignoring Jews in the displaced persons camps because of their fear of worsening relations with mainline Christian groups and Gentile organizations. You see this incredible fear among Muslim American mainstream groups who are, have just been listed by the ADL as, top anti-Israel groups. They've been blacklisted. MPAC was blacklisted. I mean, this is ridiculous. And you still see this fear of challenging Israel and challenging pro-Israel groups. Then there's this campaign that pro-Israel groups are doing with mosque and synagogue pairings, in which the mosque leadership will have to sign some kind of declaration that he will reject the delegitimization of Israel. You see this in the Latino community too, with pro-Israel attempts to co-opt leaders of MALDEF and National Council of La Raza, etc. They have to sign these declarations that they'll fight delegitimization. So it's really up to the, I think it's up to you to work on that issue, because I already enjoy massive privilege and I don't really need any help. And I think it's the same for Jewish Israelis. Okay, they're having hard time. There's a guy named Natan Blanc who has refused army service, and he has done. He's 18 years old and he's already done 8 prison terms. But generally, I mean, there was a young man in Haifa this week who was just arrested under secret evidence and put in jail because of Facebook posts where he made these vague references to something like, I can't stand it anymore, and they accused him of calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. So for them, it's much worse, and I think they're the ones who deserve your solidarity. Why I wrote this book, I've talked about this before. I grew up in Washington, and I grew up in a prominent family that happened to be Jewish, and so Zionism was going to call on me one way or another. I talked about how I went to Temple Sinai on Military Road, Hebrew school, and by the bima on the stage, there's an Israeli flag, and then there's a flag with a black drape over it. It's the UN flag, and the black drape signifies the resolution declaring Zionism to be racism. And I was in 4th grade when the rabbi explained this to me. I'm like, what the hell is Zionism? And, if some people are saying it's racism, I better investigate that. So, I began this lifelong investigation, which really accelerated with going on the Birthright Israel trip, which is a free trip for Jews 18 to 25. And then I went through a process which a lot of people, not just Jews, my age have gone through, where you watch the Second Intifada take place. You watch Operation Defensive Shield, where the Jenin refugee camp is just hollowed out and destroyed. You watch the second invasion of Lebanon. And then you watch Operation Cast Lead, and it was Cast Lead where I really snapped after a debate, actually, with a Palestinian friend, where I questioned, well, why is Hamas firing all those rockets? And, maybe they asked for it. And I was out, and I went home, and I watched footage or photographs of the police cadets who had just been killed in bombings by Israeli F-16s. And I really feel like that was the moment when I decided that I was going to start directing some of my journalistic energy towards this subject. And that my friend and everything she had been telling me was pretty much right.
We'll go right here, and we'll continue to Paul.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you see in the United States about people understanding some of these issues, and if you're seeing change, and particularly among Jewish Americans.
I don't know. I'm not the best barometer of change, because I've been involved in this for 4 or 5 years very heavily. But I did a panel once with Rashid Khalidi, and he said, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we would have never been able to do this panel. And you look at the early talks with Norman Finkelstein and how, there are fanatics literally in his face in the front row screaming at him. That doesn't happen to me at talks anymore. And I've done dozens and dozens of talks around the country. It's really setting in on college campuses. With a really diverse crowd, not just Palestinian American students. And Jews are, increasingly willing to listen to me, even if they won't come around and agree with me completely. I think there's a crisis in among liberal Jews around this issue, and J Street is kind of trying to hold the line and provide them with a safe place to be. But how long can they keep, doing this moral hand washing and listening to Peter Beinart refuse to call what's happening in Hebron apartheid before they finally draw the line? So, there was an interesting line in the Ari Shavit piece I referred to in the New Yorker, where he said, but, he's talking about Zionism, the continuation of Zionism. He said, but it's too immense for me to grapple with. Either you have to make that kind of declaration, or you have to come to some kind of conclusion that I did, because the right wing is permanently in power in Israel, and we're going to see religious nationalism continue to consolidate its grip on the key institutions of the state of Israel. It's as if the Christian right really took over the United States. How are American Jews going to relate to that? I think it'll be sort of interesting to watch over the next 10 years.
Let's go right here, and then we'll come across.
Hi. Actually, around the time I started really finding out what Israel is, because we get a lot of brainwashing in this country. And you mentioned the media doesn't cover this, whether it's
saying we're all brainwashed.
Well, our media. You don't know this. One of the things you mentioned was they're calling African refugees a cancer, and I found out about that from RT. I don't even like. And another thing that they did was to Ethiopian black Jews, and these women who were coming in without their knowledge were being injected with birth control. And you won't see that on CNN or on Fox News. Do you cover that? And I found out so many other things that happened back in the 50s. There were Moroccan Jews, the Sephardic Jews who came in, and then they were bombarding them with radiation. And it sounds like Nazis. And I was always like, how could they act like Nazis, And then I found out about a guy, it was a Jewish guy, who wrote a book, and I looked it up. They're called the Transfer Agreement, where they said Adolf Hitler was funded by the Zionist Party. And it's just really bizarre to
Do you have a question? Or
Well, I was just going to ask if you
I'll
knew
res-
about that.
Kind of respond to all that.
I'll respond to it quickly. And I think a lot of people find the Nazi comparison offensive, but so many people make it, especially people who aren't used to being attacked by pro-Israel partisans, who just, this organically comes out of them, because as Americans, that's our frame of reference. We've been educated so much about the Holocaust and the lessons of the Holocaust, and when you see things that even resemble it, even if they're on a different scale, you make that kind of comparison, and Israelis frequently make that comparison. You referred to the Havara Agreement. The Zionist movement was not funding Adolf Hitler, but there were trade agreements with Hitler and von Mildenstein, who was the boss of Adolf Eichmann and who was the first director of the Office of Jewish Affairs in Nazi Germany, was taken on a trip of kibbutzim by the revisionist Zionist leadership, and returned to Nazi Germany and wrote a paean to the revisionist Zionists. He called them the Trumpeldorians, after Joseph Trumpeldor, in Der Angriff, which was the bulletin of the SS. And the really ideological wing of the Nazi Party. And he was given a medal by Joseph Goebbels, which had a Star of David on one side and a swastika on the other. So, I mean, you constantly hear about the Grand Mufti and his anti-Semitism, but this was also happening as well, and it's interesting context for two movements simultaneously fighting each other, but also fighting to rid themselves of the British colonial authorities, and often turning to Germany, because Germany had this fight with the Brits. So there's all this fascinating history, and we have to kind of unpack it and then determine whether it's useful or not. And I don't think it's that useful to go back to all of it. I think it's really important to talk about the facts on the ground right now, and that's what I've done in my book, and how this is all structural. I think it's really important for Americans and for someone like you who's really curious to take a visit and go to both sides of the wall and talk to Israeli Jews, talk to Palestinians, and see it from the ground, and then come back and talk to your fellow Americans about that. Unfortunately, there are very few reporters who are doing that, even reporters who are stationed in Jerusalem. They are kind of like, they tend to parachute in and out of the West Bank quickly, and they spend most of their time immersed in Israeli society. Ethan Bronner was a perfect example of that, the former Jerusalem bureau chief whose son was in the Israeli army, and Jody Rudorin now, who many of my friends in Israel-Palestine know is another perfect example of someone who really feels much more comfortable in Israeli Jewish society. So it's really a question of the kind of character of the journalist, and not so much, it's not always an issue of censorship, is what I'm saying.
I've heard a left-wing activist in Israel say that the right wing is suicidal because, their dreams of annexation of the West Bank will bring upon a dramatic change in the electorate dynamics in Israel. The question is, as you interviewed a lot of these right-wingers, what's their end game? What do they think? How do they want to annex the West Bank and not bring about a demographic change in the elections, or what are their plans if they want to annex the West Bank?
That's an excellent question. Naftali Bennett has explained his plan pretty clearly, more clearly than any other Israeli politician. And we have to see all of this in light of the Levy Commission report, which is a report ordered by Benjamin Netanyahu to explore the feasibility of annexing Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, where most of the settlers live and the fewest amount of Palestinians live. It's where Palestinians are not able to build, and where many of the demolitions and expulsions are taking place right now beneath, the cordon of silence, the cordon of media silence. And so Bennett believes that because there are so few Palestinians there, they can be given some kind of secondary Israeli citizenship, or he has called for removing the barriers between that prevent Palestinians from freely traveling between Ramallah and Bethlehem, and kind of extending the space of the Bantustan state they'll receive, and then giving Jordanian citizenship to all the Palestinians who live within those Bantustan areas, basically making them equal to Jerusalem Palestinians, which will actually potentially give them some more freedom of movement than they currently enjoy. And I interviewed one of his deputies in a weird moment, and it was completely dark, and we were in the great synagogue in Jerusalem, and this guy is a fanatic from Atlanta who is also extremely charismatic, and he lives in Efrat. He looks like a guy I would have gone to college with at UPenn, and he speaks kind of with a southern accent. And he was at the bottom of Bennett's list, and he made some really interesting points, that it's the Zionist left that has built the walls. It's the Zionist left that's really in favor of checkpoints, or what they call hafradah, or separation. But Bennett's party, they're religious, and they're going to speak to the Palestinians in a religious language, and they're going to work with the patriarchs of the old families, and they're not afraid of living among Arabs. And this is kind of a traditional, this comes from the strain of revisionist Zionist, straight from Jabotinsky. They'll live with them as long as they enjoy secondary status. So that's kind of emerging among the settlers and the religious nationalists as kind of the discourse, where you'll actually see far rightists in debates with people from the Labor Party, like saying to the Laborites, why are you afraid of Arabs? Because the Laborites will be saying, your plan to annex the West Bank will destroy our demographic majority. And there is no end game. You ask, what's the end game? There is no end game. The end game is peace without peace, which is the current status quo. Thanks to Barack Obama and the U.S. government, this bipartisan consensus, there's no pressure on Israel. So what incentive do they have for actually staging a withdrawal, or actually negotiating anything? There is none. So if they have a one-way peace, they can continue to make these steps towards annexation. And finally, there's the post-Arab Spring with Syria and Egypt. These regimes have been removed that Israel could trust, and so they have less incentive than ever for withdrawal, because they can make the argument that will be immediately be destroyed by Al-Qaeda and these Islamic forces. And you hear that rhetoric increasingly from Netanyahu. We're an island of stability in a sea of tumultuous fanaticism.
We've gone over on time. If you want to,
why don't we just take all questions at once, okay, and I'll do a 2-minute answer.
Show the documentary as well. You want to do that?
How long is it? 9 minutes.
9 minutes. Okay. All right. So by show of hands, how many questions do we have? Okay. So we'll just go around the room, take them all at the same time. If we could have brief questions that end in a question mark, so that we can get responses all at one time.
And apologies, I like the sound of my voice too much, I guess.
Hi, I'm Phil Schrafer. I know you're talking about the extremes, but I understand there's a moderate politician that Netanyahu was forced to bring in his coalition government. He wanted to make the Orthodox Jews get in the army, go in the army. Lippi, is that the name? Do I have the name?
Lapin.
Lapin? Okay. I just want to know, does he have any influence in a positive way?
Okay. Gentleman here, a question.
You spoke about a campaign of indoctrination, teaching hate, basically. Is this being done at a party level? Is there some coordination? Is there a campaign to do this? And is the objective something like expelling Arabs in some way or the other?
Over here, and then we'll go.
John Salzberg with Sandy Spring Friends Meeting. We're working on a number of Quaker meetings have endorsed boycott and divestment. What do you see the impact of boycott and divestment?
So do you see that this radicalization inside Israel is also breaking a little bit the veil of hypocrisy that surrounds Israel, which has brought us here, through the Zionist left, which makes it look more democratic? Now it's fully Jewish and non-democratic, so maybe the world will get to a reckoning more quickly.
This gentleman here, and then in the corner over there.
This goes back about 15 years ago. We ran into a group over in Israel of American blacks that called themselves Jews, And obviously the Israelis didn't quite know how to deal with them, but whatever happened to that group?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. Now, you mentioned that there is an Israeli leader, a politician, who said he's atheist, I think Mr. Lieberman. And my question is the following. Since I find a contradiction in terms in that, because the only justification which is illegal, according to international law, for the Nakba is the religious argument that that was a God-given land to the Israelis. So how does he reconcile both things if you had a chance to talk to him, if he's atheist?
That's a good. First of all, these are some of the best questions I've had at any event I've done, so you should give yourselves a hand. You don't have to actually give yourselves a hand. Okay. Yair Lapid is the leading member of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition. He is the son of Tommy Lapid, who is from the aggressively secular Shinui party, he was very anti-Arab, and he's also anti-Orthodox Jew. And it's because Orthodox Jews tend to be non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist, obviously not for the same reason that some of us are. They don't have much concern for the human rights of Palestinians, but they don't want to participate in army service. And yet Ben-Gurion made this Faustian bargain with the ultra-Orthodox that they would accept the Jewish state and receive these benefits, and he would exempt them from national service. So Lapid is trying to reverse that dynamic. He's done this whole campaign of demonization against, which really fits within the militaristic ethos of Israel, where soldiers are getting paid so little. Why should the ultra-Orthodox get paid so much? And I think it's worth mentioning that if there is a one-state or binational scenario, and many of the Ashkenazi liberal Israelis of Tel Aviv and Haifa and West Jerusalem may choose to exercise their second passport and go to Europe because they don't want to live in a state where there is a majority of Arabs. They want to live in this kind of European-style colony. A villa in the jungle, as Ehud Barak defined Zionism. But the ultra-Orthodox will probably stay as long as they're left there, and they might just leave Palestinians alone as long as they can enjoy the kind of medieval lifestyle that they want to enjoy. I mean, and you talk to someone from, I'm not even using that as a pejorative. Nutare Karta openly says we want to enjoy a medieval style lifestyle. Party level indoctrination. So I don't think Yair Lapid is a moderate, and in fact he said that East Jerusalem is our ethos, so he favors the colonization of East Jerusalem. Indoctrination at the party level, you just read the section in my book called Indoctrination Mills, and I talk about how the Likud party has really ramped up efforts in the education sector to punish school principals like Ron Cohen, who I interviewed, who tell their students to question the occupation, and to encourage teachers to cultivate their children for the students for army service. And they've actually declared, the program is actually called lifelong draftees, that the teachers are lifelong draftees of the army, and it's their job to basically promote worship of generals and the culture of militarism. But just read the book. There was a question about BDS and its success, and I mean there haven't been enough material successes, but I'll point to one thing that I recently saw as a success, because Rihanna was on her way to Tel Aviv, and she apparently did this concert where she changed her lyrics and sang All I See Is Palestine, but I don't think that Palestinians could see her because they're stuck behind walls. But Variety, the Hollywood trade publication, which everyone in Hollywood reads, had to do an article about the BDS, the cultural boycott campaign against Rihanna performing there. And in order to do that article, they had to explain international law, the right of return, and why these refugees were created. And so that's the genius of BDS, is it's actually an educational device that is really promoting a lot of discourse we haven't seen before. The Zionist left, their kind of failure was a question whether this is actually a positive development. I mean, you look at Shelley Yachimovich, who is the current leader of the Labor Party. She's totally stepped away from advocating for two states or putting any pressure on Netanyahu in that realm. And she's actually praised the settlement enterprise and attempted to take ownership of it, because in fact the Labor Party through Yigal Allon did create the original blueprint for the settlements around Jerusalem. Not only that, but under Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, and later Barak, settlement growth was ramped up at a massive rate beneath the cover of negotiations. Actually, Hanan Porat, who'd recently died, was a leader of the settlement movement, and he would pressure Netanyahu by presenting him with statistics on how many settlements Shimon Peres built when he was prime minister, and say, what are you doing about this? The Labor Party's kicking your ass. So I do see it as a positive development because of this cover. They have this reputation as peacemakers, when in fact they have been responsible for Palestinians losing their permits by the thousands, for sealing off Gaza, for creating the blueprint for the separation wall, for massive settlement construction. And now it's kind of exposed, and we see the crisis playing out within the Jewish American establishment. The Black Hebrews were mentioned. They are a syncretic religious community that lives in Dimona, where the Israeli, what's known as the textile factory in Israel, but which is actually a nuclear facility, is located, and they've been put there for a reason. It's kind of like why the Mormons wound up in Salt Lake City, because it's a lake you can't really fish in, so it's the only place they could go. And they've built a pretty vibrant community there that was visited by Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown at one point. My friend David Sheen, who made the documentary we'll watch with me, lives there. He's relocated there because partly he has married an African-American woman who was having and he felt uncomfortable being in an interracial relationship in Tel Aviv, and wanted to be basically in a more tolerant environment. But many of the Black Hebrews have trouble securing residency. I think only one has received citizenship, and they're living in limbo. And their relationship to the state is fascinating. David Sheen is really the person to look to for information on this. And to the Black Hebrews themselves, they're very accessible, and they're basically Americans. I met one at an anti-African rally recently in Tel Aviv. He just walked up to me. He had left the community. His brother was still there, and he just looked at the rally and he said, how could Jews, having gone through what they've gone through, be so hateful to us? And I'm like, well, come on, man. I don't have all night here. So that really highlights the interesting and tension they have with the state of Israel. And finally, about atheism. Benjamin Netanyahu, I believe, is an atheist. I don't think he believes in God. Definitely Avigdor Lieberman is an atheist. Most of the post-Soviet Russian emigres to Israel are atheists. The founders of the state of Israel, the real founding generation, were atheists. David Ben-Gurion explicitly said in his memoirs, I don't believe in God, but the Torah is my blueprint for building the state of Israel. So how do you overcome that contradiction? Or you don't. It just doesn't make sense. You're basically saying, I don't believe in God, but God gave me the land. And that relates to the fact that there is no real legitimate document that provides legitimacy to the concept of an exclusively Jewish state. Not the Balfour Declaration, not the partition plan, which actually created a binational state requiring ethnic cleansing, because the area that would have been given to Israel was only 55% Jewish before the Nakba. And there have been no other documents since then. So before we move to this, I love that question. I love talking about this. Before we move to the documentary, I'll read a paragraph from my book about that. When he entered the prime minister's office in 2009, Netanyahu immediately set himself to what he did best, spinning the herd of clueless American reporters and columnists who parachuted into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv each week. In August 2010, following the bloody Israeli raid on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, the conservative American columnist George Will flew to Israel to meet with the prime minister. Will returned with an error-laden ode to Netanyahu, rehashing a tall tale that the prime minister first told at the annual AIPAC conference in Washington. Nevertheless, a display case in Netanyahu's office could teach the Obama administration something about this leader, the awestruck Will wrote. It contains a small signet stone that was part of a ring found near the Western Wall. It is about 2,800 years old. 200 years younger than Jerusalem's role as the Jewish people's capital. The ring was the seal of a Jewish official whose name is inscribed on it, Netanyahu. What was Netanyahu's connection to the ring, and by extension to the ancient land of Israel? There was none. Netanyahu's grandfather, Nathan Milikovsky, had merely changed his name to Netanyahu after he emigrated from Lithuania to Palestine. Thus, Netanyahu had a much closer relation to the former Alaskan governor and vice presidential hopeful Sarah Palin, whose Lithuanian maternal grandfather was rumored to be a Jew, than to any Bronze Age Jewish official from the Middle East. Intended to assert his legitimacy to rule over the land of Israel, Netanyahu's magical ringtail rested on the same logical fallacy as my own dubious assertion to a historical mandate to rule over Mexico because my grandfather, Jaime Blumenthal, had changed his name to Jaime Quetzalcoatl. Despite his reliance on childlike myths that recalled the plot of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings fantasy trilogy, or perhaps because of it, Netanyahu was able to inject his Hasbara into the mainstream American media without the slightest difficulty. And now it's movie time.